This was not a joke. This was not banter. This was a deliberate, strategic insult. At Davos, Donald Trump looked straight at Canada and said the quiet part out loud. Be grateful. You survive because of us. Canada is basically the 51st state of the United States. That sentence alone detonated decades of alliance discipline. And here is the part Washington is not ready to admit. This was not strength. This was a fatal misread of power. Because while Trump was busy humiliating Canada on a global stage, capital was already moving, supply chains were already rerouting, trust was already collapsing. This is not a cultural spat. This is not ego theater. This is economic war disguised as trolling. Trump framed Canada as a dependent, a freeloader, a country that lives off American generosity. But what he actually did was something far more dangerous. He publicly signaled to the world that the United States treats even its closest allies as disposable. And Canada heard that message loud and clear. Just hours earlier, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a cold, surgical warning at Davos. Nostalgia is not a strategy. The old United States-Canada order is over, permanently. Trump's response was not diplomacy. It was domination language. And here is the core contradiction you need to sit with. Why would the United States choose to humiliate a partner that controls critical energy, minerals, agriculture, and logistics at the exact moment global supply chains are fracturing? Why pick a fight that does not weaken Canada, but instead accelerates its exit? Because this is how empires stumble. And in the next section, we are going to break down the economic reality Washington is pretending not to see. To understand why Trump's insult was not just reckless, but strategically illiterate, you need to understand what Canada actually represents inside the North American economic system. Canada is not a side partner. Canada is a structural pillar. Start with energy. Canada supplies roughly 60% of United States crude oil imports, not hypothetical barrels, not emergency supply, daily, embedded, irreplaceable flows. Refineries in the Midwest and the Northeast are engineered specifically for Canadian heavy crude. You cannot just switch suppliers without multi-year retrofits and massive cost overruns. Electricity tells an even more uncomfortable story. In states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, cross-border electricity imports from Canada account for up to 1/4 of grid stability during peak demand. When temperatures spike or storms hit, Canadian hydro is the buffer that prevents blackouts. Now let's talk agriculture, because this is where denial turns into delusion. Canada produces more than 90% of the potash used by United States farmers. Potash is not optional, it is fertilizer. No potash means lower yields. Lower yields mean higher food prices. This is not ideology, this is chemistry. Add aluminum, add uranium, add nickel, add cobalt, add rare earth processing capacity that the United States talks about rebuilding but has not yet done. And then there's logistics. North American manufacturing runs on just-in-time supply chains. Engines cross the border 7 or 8 times before final assembly. Auto parts, aerospace components, medical devices. This is an integrated system measured in hours, not months. Any disruption instantly raises marginal costs, destroys predictability, and spooks capital. This is why Trump's framing of Canada as a dependent is backwards. Interdependence is not weakness, it is efficiency. But here is the problem. Interdependence only works when trust exists. Once trust fractures, firms do not wait for policy clarification. They move. They reroute capital. They diversify suppliers. They redesign logistics away from the source of volatility. And when the President of the United States publicly calls his largest trading partner a freeloader and a state, that is not tough talk. That is a risk signal. Markets do not argue, they respond. And in the next section, you're going to see exactly how this so-called strength backfires directly onto American workers, farmers, and states that thought this was someone else's problem. Here is where Trump's strategy stops being abstract and starts hurting real Americans. Because tariffs, insults, and humiliation do not land on balance sheets in Washington. They land in factories, ports, farms, and households across the United States. Let's start with agriculture. When Canada hears you are a freeloader, Ottawa does not panic. It recalculates, and the first lever it adjusts is procurement. Fertilizer contracts, grain logistics, long-term supply guarantees. American farm associations have been quietly warning about this for months. One Midwestern cooperative put it bluntly, "You cannot weaponize your top fertilizer supplier and expect food prices to stay stable. That is not politics, that is physics." Potash disruptions do not show up immediately. They show up one season later when yields drop and grocery prices spike. That delay is what makes this damage politically lethal. Now move to manufacturing. In Michigan and Ohio, auto plants depend on components that cross the Canadian border multiple times. Every time Trump escalates rhetoric, insurers raise risk premiums. Customs delays increase, warehousing costs rise, margins shrink. Executives do not hold press conferences about this. They quietly move future investment elsewhere. And then there is the Northeast. New York and New England rely on Canadian hydroelectric imports during winter peaks. When diplomatic hostility rises, so does uncertainty around long-term contracts. Energy traders price in volatility. Consumers pay the difference. One energy association executive summarized it perfectly. "We built this grid assuming cooperation, not coercion." Florida feels it too, but differently. Canadian tourists are one of Florida's most reliable visitor groups. When the President of the United States mocks their country on a world stage, sentiment shifts. Travel plans change. Real estate purchases slow. These are soft signals, but they compound. And here is the most dangerous part of the backfire: capital perception. When investors see the United States treat a stable, democratic, rule-of-law partner as disposable, they start asking a simple question. If this is how Washington treats Canada, how safe are we? That question is poison. It raises borrowing costs, it shortens investment horizons, it accelerates diversification away from the United States, not because of ideology, but because of risk management. Trump thinks he is projecting dominance. What he's actually doing is broadcasting unreliability. And that is why Canada's response is not emotional, it's strategic. In the next section, we're going to examine the counter-strategy already unfolding behind closed doors, one that does not involve begging Washington for respect. While Washington fixates on humiliation, Canada is doing something far more dangerous to American leverage. It is building a way out. Prime Minister Carney's response at Davos was not rhetorical, it was architectural. When he said Canada and its allies must build something bigger, better, stronger out of the fractures, that was not a metaphor, that was a blueprint. First, infrastructure. Canada is accelerating east-west logistics that deliberately bypass the United States. Rail corridors linking Western Canada directly to Atlantic ports are being expanded. Capacity at ports like Halifax and Prince Rupert is rising, quietly, methodically, with one goal: optionality. Optionality is power. Second, Mexico. Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CPKC, is no longer a trade story, it's a strategic weapon. A single rail spine now connects Canada directly to Mexican manufacturing and ports without touching United States choke points. Automotive, energy, and agricultural flows are already being redesigned around this axis. This is not retaliation,
This is insulation. Third, Europe. Canada is activating trade agreements that Washington once treated as symbolic. European partners are not just buyers, they're co-investors. Energy offtake agreements, critical minerals processing, long-term procurement contracts that lock in demand outside the United States market. Fourth, and this is where Washington really loses control, the Gulf and Asia.
Qatar is not charity, it is capital. Long horizon, politically neutral, infrastructure-grade capital. The same goes for Asian buyers who do not lecture, threaten, or insult partners publicly. And then there is China. Canada is not pivoting to China out of affection. It is doing so out of math. When your largest customer signals volatility, you diversify, even if the alternative comes with complications. This is the mistake Trump keeps making. He assumes dependence equals submission. It does not. Dependence triggers escape velocity. Every insult accelerates Canada's timeline. Every threat makes diversification politically easier in Ottawa. Every joke about the 51st state becomes justification for sovereign redundancy. And here is the part Washington is missing entirely. Once supply chains are rebuilt, they do not come back. Infrastructure is sticky. Contracts are long-term. Trust, once replaced, does not reappear because a different president takes office. Canada is not trying to punish the United States. Canada is preparing for a world where the United States is unreliable. And in the next section, we will look at the broader geopolitical shift this triggers, because the damage does not stop at North America. This is where the damage becomes permanent. Because what Trump shattered at Davos was not a trade agreement, it was something far more valuable: alliance credibility. Geopolitics does not run on press releases. It runs on expectations, on patterns, on the assumption that tomorrow will look roughly like today. When that assumption dies, strategy rewrites itself automatically. Canada has now crossed a psychological threshold. For the first time since the post-war order, Ottawa is openly planning for a future where the United States is not the anchor, but the variable. And once a country does that, the relationship never returns to its old form. This is why even a Trump exit does not reverse the damage. Trust is not cyclical. Trust is cumulative. Every investor, every ministry, every allied capital is now asking the same question. What happens if the next administration does this again? That uncertainty is fatal. It means redundancy replaces efficiency. Diversification replaces integration. Regional blocks replace alliance loyalty. And here is the quiet winner in all of this. China does not need Canada to love it. China only needs Canada to hedge. Every Canadian diversification move weakens United States leverage by default. Beijing gains optional access to resources, technology partnerships, and trade flows without firing a single shot. Russia benefits too, indirectly. A fractured Western alliance means slower coordination, weaker sanctions enforcement, and more transactional diplomacy. Moscow thrives in ambiguity. It feeds on division. The irony is brutal. Trump believes humiliation creates obedience. In reality, it creates alternatives. When the United States treats allies as vassals, it invites them to behave like sovereigns again. And sovereignty, once reasserted, does not retreat quietly. This is how empires lose influence, not through defeat, but through self-inflicted erosion. And now we arrive at the final question. Power is not measured by how loudly you speak. It is measured by how many people choose to stand with you when you do not have to shout. At Davos, Donald Trump chose humiliation over leadership. And in doing so, he revealed a truth the world can no longer ignore. The United States is willing to weaponize dependence, even against its closest allies. Canada did not overreact. Canada adapted. And adaptation is irreversible.
Once nations build alternatives, they do not dismantle them out of nostalgia. Once trust is broken, it is not restored by slogans or elections. It is replaced, quietly, permanently, structurally. So here's the question that matters now. Did Trump just win a moment of applause while accelerating the long-term erosion of American influence? Or is this the beginning of a world where alliances are no longer built on trust, but on escape routes? Drop your take in the comments, because what just happened at Davos was not a joke. It was a warning.